And in my career, I found over and over again that the solution to most problems was hiding inside the obstacle. In other words, if you could peel the obstacle like a banana, inside the middle of the obstacle was the solution.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. I am very excited to bring you this week's guest. He's an advertiser, an entrepreneur, an author, and the host of one of Canada's most popular radio programs. He's got a distinctly playful, droll, yet resonant voice that has probably already given him away, and I have to say I'm a pretty big fan of his work. His radio program, Age of Persuasion, which is now called Under the Influence, showed me what radio and podcasting is capable of, just half an hour per week at a time. He's someone whose brain I've wanted to pick for years, and I think you'll agree that our conversation does not disappoint. His name is Terry O'Reilly. Terry has had a long and fruitful career in marketing. He's created thousands of ads, especially for radio, and in 1990 he founded Pirate Radio to ensure that creativity and copywriting is at the center of his marketing work. Now, this has led to the hugely popular radio program on CBC, and a couple years ago he published his second book, This I Know, Marketing Lessons from Under the Influence. My conversation with Terry is anchored by this book, which is itself filled to the brim with fascinating stories, insider knowledge and guidance, not just for marketers, but for any storyteller, any creative person, and for that matter, anyone who wants to push a brand or an idea on social media. Terry and I talk about social media and the other disruptions that are facing the advertising world, and we get into where things might be headed in the coming years, although he admits he doesn't like the crystal ball. We talk about Terry's endless curiosity, his penchant for humor, but not at the expense of a core message or idea. We tackle the rise of public relations, which used to be a step down from marketing, but now leads the charge. And Terry even gives me the scoop on his next project, the first time he's made it public anywhere. But I think the key theme to this conversation is the same one that invigorates Terry's show, Under the Influence, and has kept me listening all these years. Because we're talking here about human nature, about what drives us as human beings, what the story is, what compels us. Thomas Jefferson once remarked that the most honest part of a newspaper is the advertising. Good ads aren't tricks or subliminal messages. They aren't misleading or magic. Good ads simply get it. They get you. They get me. A core idea, often a counterintuitive idea, that you just can't shake because it's true. Advertising is at its best when it is a mirror right back into ourselves, a breadcrumb trail that helps us answer, what on earth is going on? Now, before we get to the conversation, I wanted to mention that the entire archive of Terry's show, Under the Influence, is now available for free. You can get all episodes as a digital box set anywhere you get your podcasts. And for more information on that, you can go to our website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. While you're there, you can get in touch with me by email or on social media. Give me your feedback on this episode as well as your suggestions for future ones. As always, I look forward to hearing from you. Now, recorded over Skype, a first for this podcast, here is my conversation with Terry O'Reilly. Okay, Terry O'Reilly, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for taking the time. I'm really excited to talk to you. Your CBC show, Under the Influence, and then the show before that, Age of Persuasion, had a big, so to speak, influence on me growing up and developing my thoughts about the world. And I think I still think about it quite often. So I'm really excited to chat with you. And I read your book actually as well, which is kind of a collection of a lot of the things that you learned over your years of running that show. And of course, in your years working as an ad man. And that book is called This I Know, Marketing Lessons from Under the Influence. It's packed with anecdotes. There's so much information in there. And I was blown away by how many incisive stories there are about advertising, about marketing, but maybe most importantly, about human nature. And that's one thing that you often refer to, which is that when you're doing marketing and you're doing advertising, you're really talking about human nature. And if you understand what it means that makes people tick, then you can know how to sell them something. Maybe even sell them not the product, but the solution that they're looking for. But I want to talk about all of that stuff, and I want to talk about the disruption that is currently happening in the advertising, whether through social media, the digital age, politics, of course. But before we do, you've got the first question, and you can take this, Terry, any way you like. What on earth is going on?
Where to start with that, Ben? Where to start? Well, there's a lot going on in my life. I'll start there right now. That I'm starting my third book. So I just signed a contract for my third book. I don't want to say too much about it yet, but I will say that it will be an exploration of silver linings. I'll say that much.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And a book is really a journey. Having done two of them now, it is really an absolute journey, because the researching and writing of a book takes X amount of time. And then the editing process with an editor takes probably another 50% of that time. And then you go on a book tour. So it is an experience and a journey, writing a book. Let me tell you, if you've never done it, it's wonderful, but it is a journey. We're about to launch. I haven't really made this official yet, but we're about to launch a podcast production company soon, because we have a lot of experience in that space. And we want to create a company that puts out really wonderful podcasts. And we're really going to think on a global scale on this company. So that launch will be imminent. So that's sort of big news. This is the first time I've said this publicly.
Excellent. Well, this is your announcement on the What on Earth is Going On podcast.
That's right. So there you are. You've got the scoop on that one, because like I say, we haven't announced it anywhere yet, because we're just getting it off the ground. So the show's rolling on. We're in our 14th season, Ben, of our radio show. There was an earlier iteration of it too, by the way. You said Under the Influence and Age of Persuasion. The first series was called O'Reilly on Advertising, which was just to be a summer replacement show. That was our first blush with the CBC, when we went in and pitched this crazy idea to CBC, and then they actually said, "We'll take it," which shocked us. And then they took us on as a summer replacement series for July and August back in 2005, when one of their bigger shows went on hiatus. And they test drove us to see what the reaction would be to a show on advertising on the advertising-free CBC. And the reaction was wonderful. And then here we are 14 years later.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. You talk about that in your book, and you've talked about that in multiple speeches, about how you got this show started with the CBC, which seemed an anathema to what you did. This oasis away from advertising and marketing. And yet people who listened to the CBC needed or wanted a window in. And that was your elevator pitch, which is one thing you have a whole chapter about the elevator pitch.
I'm a big believer in elevator pitches.
Yeah, and it was a successful pitch, really, because it's such a clear idea that we're going to give a backstage pass to the world of advertising, a world that, at least in North America, say unlike Brazil, which is another thing that you talk about how in Brazil, ad men are celebrities.
Are revered, yeah.
Right, and in Canada and the United States, we see it as sometimes an impingement on our time, whether it's during television or radio listening. But we don't look back into the world and what it reveals not only about the world of advertising, but what that says about us, the viewers, the listeners, the consumers of all of this millions and millions of points of data that are being sent to us. And I think that was the powerful impact on me listening to your show.
Well, that's interesting, Ben, because we really didn't think CBC would buy the show, by the way. We went in there wondering if they would be even remotely interested in something like this. The way we pitched it, as I think I mentioned in the book, was exactly what you just mentioned. We said, advertising is like architecture. It's everywhere in your life. Most people hate it, find it annoying, find it an intrusion. But at the heart of it, it is a fascinating business because it's the study of human nature, as you mentioned earlier. And that, I think, was what the CBC loved most about the pitch. It wasn't so much about letting people into the closed world of advertising, which it was, because Mike Tennant and I, when we pitched the show, we weren't journalists and we're not academics, we're not pundits. We were working ad men in the trenches. So we knew what we were talking about, and we had access to the back rooms of the advertising industry. So it was a mixture of that, but more so the study of human nature, which has been the most fascinating part of my career to this day, is what does make us tick? What makes us make a decision? What can a brand say to us that actually resonates or, cuts through the clutter? All of that, the puzzle of marketing, has fascinated me for almost 40 years now.
Well, and I think what's so successful about your program and about your book, and even the way that you're talking now, is it seems like you are continually surprised along with the rest of us of what advertising is capable of. By that, I mean, not to say that you're naive, but that when you're, because obviously you have a career in this, but when you're discovering something, you approach it with the discovery of a kid on opening a box and seeing, look at this. This is what this is saying about, like you said, human nature. And that sense of excitement and discovery, for me, animates Under the Influence. It animates your book, and it makes it not only easy to consume and understand and listen to, but also much more profoundly insightful.
Well, I love to hear that, Ben, because I do have a philosophy. I was a martial artist for many, many, many years. And my philosophy is I maintain a white belt mentality. That's what I call it. In other words, even though I've been in this business almost 40 years now, I literally learn every day, and I am wide open to learning every day. So I don't assume I know it.
Yeah, and that's the spirit I think that I'm getting at, and it's a very helpful thing. I interviewed someone on this program a little while ago who's a chemist, and she said that being a scientist is really necessitates being a kid, having the mind of a kid. Yep. Which is that you're open to new experiences and you don't judge the experiences you have. You accept them and you move on from them. You build from them. And again, that's the spirit, I think, of your work. With all of that...
It's endless. Sorry, Ben. It's endless curiosity for me. I'm endlessly curious about almost any topic you could throw my way. Even my reading material, on my desk would be a book called The 50 Plants That Changed the World. Or the most famous eulogies of all time. Like, I'll have that kind of eclectic reading going on because I'm just insatiably curious.
Well, in a way, this conversation is a match made in heaven. One of the things I wanted to call this show, other than What on Earth is Going On when I started, was a dilettante's podcast. Yeah. Because there's no area of human nature, of life, of our story, of the universe, if we even exclude human beings, that I'm not interested in. And some people have commented on that with this show. Find your niche and explore that and dig down into one particular area. And unfortunately, that's not where my nose takes me. My nose draws me into subject matters that tomorrow might be completely different than the one today. But given your breadth and wealth of experience in advertising, the books that you've written, and of course the shows that you've done, can you talk about, and of course this unending, ceaseless curiosity that you have, what is happening in the world today that is surprising you, that is driving you to understand it, either from an advertising and marketing perspective or just from a perspective of human curiosity? What are the disruptions, the events, the characters, the actions, the ideas that are fertile for discovery today?
One of my biggest overriding concerns in my field in advertising is hyper targeting and algorithms. I'm wary of it because so much of it is not transparent. That I know that marketers love data. I mean, they love gathering data. And I understand why, because you always want to know as much as possible about your target market in order to be relevant. But there is a insidious aspect to algorithms where you're being hunted online when you don't really know you're being hunted online, that an algorithm is tracking where you're shopping or what you're interested in. For example, I was doing a research this week for an upcoming episode on law firm advertising, which is interesting because lawyers have been around since the Emperor Claudius, AD 50, and weren't allowed to advertise until 1987. Which I find fascinating. Anyway, that was the topic, and I'm doing lots of research. And then, of course, what I'm getting on my all the ads that that I noticed popping up on my screen are all for lawyers. Even though I'm just researching the topic, I'm not researching needing legal representation. I mean, it's that kind of, there's somebody listening. It's not a human being. I get it. It's an algorithm. But there's something about that I think is detrimental to the advertising business as a whole. That prior to algorithms, Ben, if you saw an ad, you knew exactly what it was doing. In many ways, advertising was one of the most transparent industries in the world, because if you saw an ad, you knew it was trying to sell you something. Now you don't know that, which is one of the reasons I changed the show's title from Age of Persuasion to Under the Influence, is because we've shifted from a persuasion-based industry to a quietly industry based on influence. So that's one of the biggest things I'm worried about.
Well, that's a fascinating thought. I mean, it's one that we all are considering, obviously. I remember when Edward Snowden came out with his revelations about the extent to which governments in the UK, Canada, the United States, the Five Eyes countries were spying on their own people. It shocked us at first, and now we kind of just accept that whatever we're doing on our computers, which is most of our lives, whatever we're doing on our phones, which is most of our lives, is being analyzed not just by government, but by corporations. And it's something that we've just kind of accepted. And when Edward Snowden first happened, it seemed like, we're going to stop this. It seemed like a paradigm shift was about to happen, and then it didn't. And actually the new paradigm was, the world with insidious marketing and advertising and targeting, plus our acceptance of that. And I just wanted to point to another thing you said, though, about law firms advertising since you said 1987. Is that right?
In Canada's 87, in the States 1977.
And to me, that is so interesting, because one of the questions I've returned to when I think about marketing and advertising and corporate power is the extent to which it has influenced our own culture. It's in other words, reflected back, art mirroring life and life then mirroring art, right? So before, and I don't know this is a question for you, but before law firms started advertising, I assume you didn't see, accident injury lawyer ads on the backs of buses.
Right.
Now that we've seen them for 30 years in Canada, 40 years in the United States, and maybe in other countries for different lengths of time, has that influenced the way we think about the world around us, about accidents and injuries, about lawyers themselves, and about how we interact through the legal system? In other words, is it no longer just, another service that's available to me and transparently telling me what it's selling? Is it actually on a deeper level changing the way that we perceive the world?
That's an interesting question. And I've been thinking a lot about that as we build this show, this episode. What's interesting to me was generationally, it's interesting because I am of an age where most, the bulk of my life, lawyers could not advertise. So when lawyers started to advertise, my wife and I were talking about this the other day, that we felt that only bad lawyers advertised, that only shady lawyers were aggressive advertisers. So that was our feeling, because for most of our lives, lawyers did not advertise. So we had it. That initial feeling about it. My daughters, on the other hand, who grew up only seeing law firm advertising, in other words, it wasn't novel or weird or unusual, do not have that feeling. They feel that's just another service that is out there, and the advertising tells you who's out there, what they offer you, and what their rates are. So it's a lot of the answer to your question, Ben, is generationally. It has a big effect on you depending on what year you were born.
Right. And so much of this is now I have to pick out which lawyers are advertising on the level with me in the same way that I'm going to pick out which computer to buy.
You know what? I say that in the show too. It's like any category, even though it's such a new category, advertising, legal advertising, law firm advertising, it has evolved the same way every category has, which is to say it's a mixed bag of really bad work, really boring work, and then some real, oases of brilliant work.
Well, and this relates actually to an episode you had on Under the Influence, which is about companies that have never advertised. And one thing you say in that episode is the old adage that advertising is a tax that companies pay for bad customer service.
Right.
So this is Lululemon, The Body Shop. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. Costco have never advertised, and it's almost exclusively.
That is astounding, isn't it?
Yeah, it's incredible. And yet, do you find that that's still true, or because of the age of social media, are these companies now embracing just a new form of advertising marketing, which may be free, but there's a different cost to it, whether it's opportunity cost or hiring a social media manager? I mean, is this changing, or?
It is changing, Ben, because the world of public relations is emerging in a huge way now. So for many, many years, public relations agencies, PR companies, which are the cousins of advertising agencies, were really peripheral to a brand's marketing. They were, big brands retained PR agencies, but it wasn't a big part of their marketing. I would say now PR firms are kind of ascendant. They are getting more and more attention. I see all sorts of big creative directors moving from mainstream advertising to become the creative directors of PR firms, which would have never happened in my era in marketing and advertising, Ben. That you would never have made this switch. It would feel like going backwards in your career to go from an advertising agency to a PR agency, and now the opposite is happening. So I see that as a big change in the way companies are marketing themselves, because it's about it's not spin, it's about managing the non-paid media, right? It's about getting your message out to newspapers, magazines, bloggers. It's everything but it's the part of your marketing that you don't control every word of.
Right, which can be so much more powerful. There's one chapter of your book where you talk about how Oreo responded during the Super Bowl to a power outage, and within a few minutes came up with a tweet that had an image of an Oreo that said, "I think you can still dunk in the dark."
That's right.
And that gained them more followers, more interest, more excitement, and possibly more sales than any ad they could have possibly.
Well, not only that ad, Ben, that little tweet got them more attention than the Super Bowl ad they ran in the Super Bowl that they probably paid $5 million for.
Right. And so therefore PR, as we call it, would be therefore much more valuable to a company or the same thing. Advertising and PR become almost indistinguishable from one another. And I guess maybe the question is do you, first of all, is that what we're seeing, is that they're coming together and being blended so that really political PR, celebrity PR, and corporate PR are kind of all the same thing? And then second of all, is that a good thing? Do you think that that's a positive thing, or do you think it's again part of this less transparent world that we seem to be living in?
Well, I think it's a good thing for brands, because I think PR is getting a seat at the table, and an important seat at the table. So in my 35 years working in the advertising business, I don't know if I was ever in a meeting where there was a public relations person present. Like, that's pretty amazing. 35 years at the highest level of the advertising business, thousands of meetings with brands at the highest levels, and a PR person was never in the meeting, which is astounding to me, because you would think that the brand advertising and the public relations should walk in lockstep, or at least know what each other's doing and then, divvy up the tasks. Now that's changed. So now you've got PR at the table, and in many ways, sometimes they're leading the charge. So I think that's good for brands. Is it good for the world at large? I think so. I think it's good that it's all coming together, rather than one being quiet and one being loud. I think they're just both being loud now, so they're more trackable that way. Mm-hmm. Tesla is another interesting company too, Ben, if I may, on this subject of non-advertisers. Tesla really doesn't advertise per se, but and I was thinking about doing an episode on this, what their marketing consists of other things. For example, if you recommend a Tesla to somebody who then buys a Tesla, you get a huge, either a rebate, or you get the chance to actually win a Tesla car, or you get a huge amount of money off your next Tesla. Like, in other words, the marketing Tesla's doing is it's one-on-one. As they're talking to their own customers, saying, if you bring a buyer to us, watch what we'll do for you in return. That's their marketing.
Yeah, and well, where marketing becomes indistinguishable from customer service in a way.
Yeah.
I remember I met a guy not long ago from South Africa who bought a Tesla and is willing to wait for years to have this car delivered to him. So in a way, for him, and it's kind of what you talk about in the beginning of your book about, you know, problems versus solutions, and that, you know, companies try to solve problems with their products, but customers are looking for solutions. I think one of the great quotes is that no customer is looking for a 3/4 inch screw. They're wanting to buy 3/4 inch holes.
Right.
And so this guy from South Africa is willing to wait 2 years for a car. He clearly isn't buying a car. He's clearly not buying a mode of transportation.
Right.
He's buying, whether we call it a status symbol or just a piece of pride that he can hold with him, maybe a sense that he's doing good for the world or for his community, or just helping this company grow because he's a fan of Elon Musk. And, you know, this is another element of brand and the power of brand. And that when I drink a Coca-Cola, I'm buying into a lifestyle and an identity, which is, you know, maybe old news. But I think what maybe we're experiencing is, again, this kind of idea that life is reflecting art, and that to what extent in the social media era, where it's so much about I'm putting my image online and I'm sharing my clever thoughts on Twitter, and my best self is being put forward on Instagram to get as many likes as I possibly can, to what extent am I as the individual becoming like every other corporate brand? And it's reminding me of another conversation I had on this podcast with a guy who's an expert on the mafia. And one thing that he's written about is how mafiosos, there used to be no dress code in the mafia. Back in the time of The Godfather in the 1930s and 40s, there was no dress code. You were a gangster. Now there's a dress code, which is almost exactly like how they dress in The Sopranos. The mafiosos watch The Sopranos. Organized criminals watch the TV shows, they watch the movies, they watch all the same stuff that you and I do, and they're being influenced by it, and therefore they're acting it out. They're performers in their own novel and movie and game. And I think that might be happening with us. We've been seeing Pepsi as a brand, as a personality in our lives for so long. For someone like me, I don't remember a time when companies and corporations didn't take on a personality or a persona. Am I therefore in 2019 as a millennial, am I taking this on as my own, you know, quote unquote corporate brand?
Well, I do. I think you are. And there's a chapter in my book on personal branding, because with all of us having our own media now, which is the big seismic change in the world, when social media appeared, we suddenly could broadcast ourselves to the world. And it got, you know, it was bumpy and you know, kind of badly done in the early days, and then people slowly got more savvy about it. And I think the way they got more savvy about it was by adopting some of the techniques and strategies of big brands. In other words, this is what I say in the book, that, you know, if you're projecting an image or a persona to the world, look after it. So it's what you say, it's what you choose to comment on, it's the language you use, it's what you choose to retweet or to repost, or like all of that. If you retweet something, that says something about you. If you're retweeting it without comment, it's weird. If you're retweeting it with a comment, I get your point of view on it. In other words, everything about what you choose to curate on your social media says something about you. And that's what brands are always doing for the last 100 years, is everything a brand puts out there is very careful and carefully selected and made sure that it's on point. So we are becoming brands.
Well, and I mean, this is getting into, you know, the whole idea of influencers, right? On Instagram or Twitter or whatever platform we're talking about, we have people in the world who have millions and millions of followers. And they will obviously be paid by companies to advertise a particular product. But there's a new wave now of micro influencers. So that maybe these people appeal, they have 2,000, 5,000 followers, but they're rooted in a particular community, whether it's geographical or an interest-based community. And if you pay 1,000 micro influencers, 1/1000th each of what you would pay to a mega influencer, you might get bigger bang for your buck because they seem to be more authentic and they seem to be more connected to that community. They have the time. If I have 3,000 followers, I can engage with almost every single one of them. Whereas if someone with 100 million can't possibly do that. But, if I'm fast forwarding 10, 20, 30 years from now, or maybe even a shorter period of time, will I get to a point where brands, big corporate brands, just can't compete anymore with the authenticity of the individual? Or are we heading to a place where there's such a concentration of power, with whether it's with algorithms or artificial intelligence or just the collective power of money and influence online, that I'm almost living in an oligopoly in the internet world? I mean, there are many people that say the internet has already gone too far away from the old Wild West days when you could be you. I mean, I know those are two kind of a dichotomy there that maybe is getting away from the simple answer, but where do you think we're headed if we had to be headed one way or the other?
Oh, so hard to say, Ben. I'm not really fond of crystal ball predictions because, everything takes a left at Albuquerque in about a month and then nothing is exactly what you thought it was going to be. I don't know. That's a really, really interesting and insightful question you're asking. If I think about it, my first instinct is to say, I think brands will have a harder time competing with it, with as much, because so much of us are also out there taking up space in the internet and in the ether. I think it'll be much harder for brands not only to be authentic, but just to actually get attention, because there's so much out there. Think of all the videos that we, as regular civilians, upload to YouTube, and all the podcasts that are going out there, and all, like, it's, the amount of podcasts on iTunes is now almost 600,000, I think I read, like individual, not episodes, but individual shows.
Yeah.
Right now. That's an interesting aspect too that we can talk about. That at Pirate, my production company, which was a sound production company, when the internet, of course, came, changed everything, and we were trying to evolve with the internet. It was interesting that sound really didn't take off on the net. Like, the first thing you'd go to on a website would be to turn off the sound, right?
Yeah.
And nobody wants sound on a website, and sound, like, we really struggled to find a place to exist in the internet side of our business because nobody wanted sound. And now we see the evolution of the internet, where podcasting, which is really could only be born of the internet, and artificial intelligence like Alexa, etc., that sound is now having a renaissance in the internet. So that's a huge, huge change, right? And then I want to go back to another point you made about influencers and micro-influencers. When we were starting our company back in 1990, it was a production company. We created the company I could not find. And I mentioned this in my book, of course, in that I was a writer, and I always found I would hire directors and production companies as an advertising writer at an agency to produce my material, produce my television commercials, my radio commercials. And I always found myself fighting to save my work from the director over and over again. It made me crazy because I'm paying them a fortune and they're wanting to change the script, throw out the idea, throw out the sell, concentrate on the humor. They would never just try to enhance the script as it was. So my frustration led to starting a company that looked at a script from a writer's point of view, because I was a writer, that protected the idea. Now, when I was trying to get that company off the ground, we did our own little version of influencer marketing, but this was way before influencer marketing was even had a name. But here's what we did, which was interesting. We looked at the award shows, at the creative teams. So in an advertising agency, a team is a writer and an art director, right? We looked at the most award-winning teams across Canada that won the majority of the awards at the award shows. And it was really only about 6 or 7 teams that dominated the award shows out of maybe thousands of teams across Canada. So our strategy was to try and convince those 7 teams to come and work with us. Because if all those other thousands of teams saw that small little award-winning 7 teams choosing us over and over again, that would bring in all the other business, which is what we did and which exactly worked. So we used the influence of the top 7 teams to bring in all the thousands of other teams across the country.
One thing that has struck me so far in my conversation with Terry O'Reilly is his endless curiosity, which could be apparent in his books, in his radio show, in his public speaking, but it really is at the essence, at the core of who he is. He says that he maintains a white belt mentality. In other words, he approaches situations as if he were a novice, as if he doesn't know anything. And in the second half of this program, he gets further into that. His love for counterintuitive solutions is born of a need to see things as if they haven't happened yet, even though they are familiar situations. It's actually something called vuja, the opposite of déjà vu. All of that is coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. And I think another thing that I learned in reading your book, and I think that you probably honed when you built this company, Pirate Radio, and you've said that you've created over 10,000 advertisements. Is that right, on the radio?
Well, I would direct about 500 commercials a year, and then we had 6 or 7 other directors at Pirate. So I directed in my career probably, I did some math, I tried to figure it out. This is probably conservative. I think I did close to 13,000 commercials in my career.
That's incredible. And just the amount of sharpening that tool to make sure that the messaging is direct, again, transparent, so that we know what I'm doing, but also, a bit of a fake out, right? A good example of this, and I'm sure you've talked about this advertisement before, is the old IKEA lamp ad, which is, I think it's almost a minute long, and it's actually quite emotional in the beginning, and there's nice music playing, and it tells the story of a lamp that's been abandoned on the street. And of course, at the end of the commercial, the Swedish guy comes onto the screen and says, many of you feel sorry for this lamp. Well, that's crazy. It has no feelings, and the new one is much better. Yeah. And what's so funny about that, and then it says IKEA unboring. So the top message to me that I'm getting is, IKEA's funny and clever and self-deprecating. I'll go to their store because they're funny. But actually, that's not their message. Their message is, don't come to us for sentimentality. Come to us for utility. Come to us for a good deal. Come to us for the new, good, better lamp. And that message is lubricated, like you've said in your book, the WD-40 of messaging is the humor.
That's humor.
And so we think that humor is the point. I think when I'm watching an advertisement, I think, they're funny, then I'll buy their ad. But actually, no, that's just letting the message slide in a little bit nicer.
Making the intrusion as welcoming as possible. Because every ad is an intrusion, right, Ben? Like, you don't sit in front of your television. Maybe the Super Bowl is the only exception. You don't sit in front of your television to watch commercials, right? Right. The WD-40 of humor kind of, I say, takes the creak out of the door opening. Right.
Yeah, the intrusion, the penetration into my mind that I might want to refuse or pretend that I'm not affected by, which is a very common thing. But another thing that I was really struck by, and this is coming from your book, was how important it is to find a counterintuitive solution. That often the solution is in the obstacle itself to an advertising problem. So if I want to market...
I'm such a big believer in that, Ben, I can't tell you.
Well, then try to tell me.
Well, if you listen to my radio show, you know that I am endlessly fascinated by counterintuitive solutions to very sticky, almost insurmountable problems. And in my career, I found over and over again that the solution to most problems was hiding inside the obstacle. In other words, if you could peel the obstacle like a banana, inside the middle of the obstacle was the solution. And I'll tell this quick story from the book that I find fascinating, where all these chicken farmers in Africa have this problem. They raise chickens, but that area of Africa is renowned for its hawks, and the hawks were just picking off the chickens. They were losing almost 80% of their flocks, and they didn't know what to do about it. They couldn't guard them all day because they were, it's like, trying to herd cats, and they couldn't afford to put netting over an acre of land. They just didn't have that kind of money. So they started to try and rethink the problem. And they thought of all these different possible solutions to this. But then they made this interesting counterintuitive decision, I thought, to start thinking like a hawk. And once they jumped that Rubicon, once they really started to think like a hawk, they thought to themselves, okay, what do hawks love? What attracts a hawk? What does a hawk love to eat? But then that led them to the opposite. What do hawks not like? What doesn't attract a hawk? What do hawks not like? What do they not recognize as food, etc.? And that's where they stumbled on this great solution to paint the chicks purple. Because they realized while doing that thought process that the color purple is not appetizing, that there's almost no food in the wild that is purple. There's almost no food in our culture that we eat that's purple. So they found this biodegradable, non-harming paint. They painted the chicks purple for the first 10 weeks of their lives until they got big enough to fend for themselves. And a hawk would land right beside a chick painted purple and not attack it. And I thought that was such a brilliant solution to a problem that had plagued them for decades. But the solution, Ben, was in the obstacle, right? The solution was in the hawk. It wasn't exterior. Like the solution, they didn't have to go outside of the hawk. Like netting would have been outside of the hawk, right? But realizing that the color purple wasn't appetizing to a hawk came from within the problem.
Well, and do you know what I find so interesting about that? It's not just the ingenuity that was required to solve that problem, but it's exactly what you're saying, but moreover, the fact that I find that interesting as a human being when I hear that story, not just because, they were so clever to figure it out, but a good story sometimes involves exactly that. And I'm talking about a good novel, a good film, a good TV show, a good short story, whatever it is. You know those moments when the ending is the beginning, and that all along the answer was carried in the character himself. I mean, the classic Greek drama, I'm not sure if you've heard of this, is Oedipus Rex, one of the great pieces of theater that's been upheld by scholars and by theater critics and by practitioners of theater today as the ultimate story, because it is by seeking out his truth that Oedipus discovers that he is the one that caused the problem at the beginning of the play. That at the beginning of the play, there's a tilting out of equilibrium, and he's the king, so he has to solve it, which means he has to solve himself and remove himself from the equation, and in the end, he has to blind himself. And the reason I think that that's so interesting to us as humans is, again, not just because it's clever, but because I think the best stories are the ones where the truth was there all along. And so where the chickens and the chicks can hide in plain sight. That we don't need to come up with these crazy 7-layer multitudinous solutions. It's actually the solution is right there in front of us. It's the simplicity that Albert Einstein looked for example, in his physics, that, in the end, it's all kind of very clear and elegant and in front of us. And I think that I'm trying to connect here that the relationship between, these creative ideas and advertising and story, and the basic fundamental nature of story.
I also think it takes a real sophistication and experience. You have to have some miles on your odometer in order to tackle a problem that way, because I think the first instinct is to scramble to try and find an exterior solution. And I think there's almost like a Zen meditative, a state you have to get into to just calmly go, okay, let's all slow down. Let's look at the problem. Let's peel it back and just see what is the problem? What is the obstacle? Let's define the obstacle. And once you define the obstacle, you go, okay, if that's the true speed bump, how do we solve that? In other words, in the opposite of running off in all directions is to actually just be kind of, like I say, zen about it to try and find the solution. I find that absolutely fascinating.
Well, and to some extent, we have to, like you say, to get miles on our odometer, we have to scramble around in our lives in order to have that Zen moment, right? Like if I'm 21, I probably have too much interference in front of me. But like they always say, a baby doesn't hold tension in its body. It doesn't learn to take on emotional, traumatic, or just, the tension of how I hold my arm every day or because I'm right-handed. It hasn't learned things that inhibit us. And therefore we have to kind of scramble around and get miles under our belt in order to calm down and take that lesson. And one thing in your book that describes this in a way was vuja de, as opposed to deja vu, which I found excellent. And when I read that, I'm like, damn it, that's what I should have called the podcast. And I'm 42 episodes in, it's too late. But I loved that because instead of deja vu, which is, already seen, something that I've that I saw yesterday, and I feel like it was in a dream. I feel like I just saw this thing. Well, as you described vuja de, I'm looking at a familiar situation that happens all the time, every single day, but it's my looking at it that changes. I choose to shift my perspective, and I think that's kind of what you're saying. Yeah,
that you're looking at a familiar situation as if you have never seen it before.
Right.
That's hard to do. That's not an easy thing. But that philosophy is what I've always tried to do in advertising, was always to look at a product as if I'd never seen it before, or to look at the solution in a way that was so fresh that I could make somebody look at a box of Kellogg's cornflakes again. In other words, give them a reason to look at this age-old product in a fresh way. Even like, remember that funny Diamond Shreddies campaign that came out a number of years ago where they said new Diamond Shreddies, and it was really just Shreddies just turned on their sides, like a square became a diamond. I mean, it was silly, and they knew it was silly, but the silliness of it just made you look at Shreddies like a 100-year-old product and just thought, that's a very funny idea. That's a very funny thing for that old brand to say.
Well, and one thing that I learned in reading your book, and again, when you're taking the backstage pass in Under the Influence, is the extent to which advertisers and marketers require an intense creativity. And it's a prolific creativity, but it's a very real world creativity. I need to solve a problem in order to come up with whether it's a certain number of sales or a certain number of followers on Twitter or whatever the objective is. It's real world creativity. And I wondered throughout if the companies that advertisers work for would be better suited bringing them in to product development and corporate and the architecture of the company itself. Because
that's very interesting, Ben, because when I first started, my first job out of Ryerson was at a radio station. I was the only copywriter at a small radio station. So it was baptism by fire for me. But what was terrifying for me was that I quickly realized I had to come up with between 15 and 25 radio ideas a day, because that's how much volume there was at that little radio station, and I was the only writer. There was nobody to share the workload. And that was terrifying to me because, coming up with 25 different radio ideas for 25 different clients in the space of a 10-hour day or 12-hour day, as it turned out, was terrifying. But very quickly, I realized I could count on my brain. In other words, your brain is like a bicep, like it's a muscle that you can work out with. So in short order, your brain realizes, okay, I've got to pump out 25 ideas a day. Okay, that's the request. Let's answer the request. So I was able to, over time, maybe over like 3 or 4 months, I was able to generate that many ideas a day, which really calmed me right down, because it was terrifying in the beginning to think that there's no human way I could do that. So your mind really can, like I say, it can be exercised like a muscle. And I find that really interesting in the world of creativity.
Yeah, and I think whether you're a musician or a writer or you're a creative person, or really, I guess, any worker of any kind, I mean, the more you do something, the more you're going to be able to do that thing. It's not just about skill, I think, or maybe it's related to skill in the sense of you just related it to a muscle. So as a writer, the common refrain is just write. Just sit down and write. And even if you spend 8 hours a day writing garbage, it's not about going back through it and finding the diamonds, although that may be part of it. It's about the more you do it, the more you will think in terms of writing, the more you will feel in terms of writing, and then they will just start coming naturally. And the problem solving will come naturally. And it reminds me actually of an anecdote from the book about the Chicago Bulls, I think it was, going to Game 6. And they had to win Game 6 because otherwise it meant a terrible Game 7. And there were
7 in the other stadium too, not a home game.
Right, and so the coach told them to pack for just one night.
Right.
And
so much communicated in that one line. I know. So I want to jump back just one point too, Ben, because I had this thought that I just wanted to mention to you, and that is I have a great library of advertising books. I'm always collecting them, even from as far back as the 1920s right up until current ones today, because I'm a big voracious reader. One of those books was a book written in the 50s called Madison Avenue, and it was just an exploration of advertising in the 50s. But one of the chapters that was fascinating to me listed all the services an advertising agency provides to its clients. And it was 5 or 6 pages long, and it was just all the services listed one after the other. Like it would be like television commercials, comma, radio commercials, comma, print ads, comma, billboard, and it was 5 or 6 pages. But what that told me was, you were talking about should they not bring creative people into the process earlier, right? Mm-hmm. Advertising agencies in that era helped clients develop products. So, for example, Campbell's Chunky Soup, which is a big product for Campbell's, that was created in the test kitchens of BBDO Advertising in New York. So BBDO had test kitchens. That's a bygone era where an advertising agency would actually have a test kitchen. They came up with Chunky Soup. They went to Campbell's and said, we've got this product that we think it has such a definable benefit to it that we could create great advertising around it. And the definable benefit is you almost have to eat it with a fork. And that became a huge product to this day for Campbell's, but it was developed in the test kitchen of the advertising agency. So those days are long gone, Ben. But back in the day, that's where a lot of the products that have lasted, that still exist, came out of that process.
Well, to what extent are we maybe seeing that occur, but in a very different way on the internet, right? Like the diamonds that are shaped in the rough, or the pearls from the oysters of the internet, are those that build organic followings. You know, very rarely does someone go out and say, I'm going to have a 10 million following account on Twitter or Instagram. I mean, maybe they hope for that, but they just do them. They just have a voice that seems to appeal to a certain number of people. And to what extent is this sort of, we're not talking about real products like soup or computers or kitchenware or something, but we are talking about the products that seem to be important in the Western world, which is often just an image or a video or a personality or an identity. And to what extent are these products maybe being honed by this kind of 6 billion person focus group? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting too. Well, I think that's probably very true. I think we're all kind of learning together. I've always said that we're in the diaper stage of the internet world. It's early days still. I mean, when we started our radio show in 2005, Ben, Facebook, YouTube wasn't around. Facebook was maybe 1 year old. There was no smartphones. There was no Twitter, no Instagram. I mean, imagine how much has changed just in this short little time our radio show's been on the air. Like the amount of learning is extraordinary. So I think in many ways we're all learning together. Brands see something being done by a regular person on the net that was just fantastic, and then they take it and extrapolate it with a lot of media money. So I think we are all learning together in many ways.
I think you're right, and it's kind of one of the impetuses of this show. What on earth is going on? Because, I mean, the change that we're seeing obviously around us is profound, but it's also accelerating. So someone could have grown up in 18th century England and died in the same place and felt nothing had really changed.
Yep.
Someone could, be born in, say, 1850, in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, die in the 1920s and feel like the world has changed. Yeah. Today, someone could go to school this year, and then when they go to university in just a few years' time, the world has changed the paradigms have shifted in a way to the same extent as they did between 1850 and 1920. And it's hard to understand how the human brain and generational shifts can encompass this change. But one of the windows, I think, into this is advertising and the way that we try to sell ourselves to one another, our products to one another, the way companies try to personify themselves and sell their products, and of course sell solutions. And I think I think you hit the nail on the head, that we're living in a world of accelerating change, but also, that we're barely even started. Facebook in their headquarters, I don't know if they still do this, but they have signs on their wall that say, we are 1% the way there to the product we want to create.
Yeah.
And remember, when Facebook had its IPO, when they went public with their shares, the big concern was, are they going to be able to migrate to cell phones? Is Facebook going to be usable by people on mobile phones? And there were many people saying, nah, it's a desktop app. Facebook's the past. Well, who uses Facebook on their desktop? It's almost exclusively now, for many people, a scrolling phone thing.
Totally. I know it is a remarkable thing. A friend of mine, this is a number of years ago, I want to say maybe, this might be 10 years old, this story, but it's interesting. A friend of mine was going to a birthday party for his uncle who was 103. And I said to him, do me a favor, ask your uncle what the most amazing technical achievement was in his lifetime to him. And the answer was, I don't know if you could guess this. So a 103-year-old person.
And when was this? When did it happen?
I asked this 10 years ago, yeah.
Okay. I would say like like a washing machine.
The telephone.
Right.
Interesting, though. I might have chosen plane, air travel, but he said it was the telephone, and I thought that was so interesting. And the reason he said it was the telephone was it was the first time that you could talk to family, because everybody had emigrated. The big topic of our day is everybody's an immigrant, but you left behind your family back in those days. Like you would maybe never see them again, right? And just the communication that the phone opened up to calling family, calling a company if you needed something, getting bad news, good news, like all of that. That was of all the things he had seen in his 103 years, it was the telephone. And I think that's so telling, because what did you just say?
I said washing machine.
Everything in our life is on a phone.
Right.
Right? It's a remote control of our lives now, right?
Well, and the fact that we still call it a phone, right? The fact that we still relate to it as a device that connects me to someone else, right? It's just something I speak into.
Yeah. The least used a feature on that device. Yeah.
Right. The thing that nobody actually wants. When you get a phone call, it's like, hey, send a voicemail. Or I don't even check my voicemail. Send me a text.
When your phone rings, you're like, who the hell's calling me?
Yeah. Why would you be calling? It must be a telemarketer or an IRS or CRA scammer. So last question for you, Terry. What are the things that we haven't addressed in this conversation that you wish we had, that if we had another hour, what would you want to dig into, responding to the question, what on earth is going on, and the disruption that we face, and the incredible accelerating change that we are facing in our world, and just the world of advertising where you're from? What's the area that you would want to delve into if we had more time?
Well, this is going to sound old school, but this is what I firmly believe. I think in this era of accelerating technology and constant change and massive disruption, I think in my industry, I still believe it all comes down to an idea. The quality of an idea, the quality of a selling idea, the quality of impressing a branding idea against a product. I think it still all comes down to that, and I think it's getting lost in the technology and in the digital scramble. I think at the end of the day, the thing that will never be replaced is the human ability to come up with a single idea, and how powerful that is. And I always say creativity is the most powerful business tool. But again, in a nutshell, Ben, I would say it is the power of an idea that's the topic that I'm constantly referencing in my shows and in my books, and I just think that simplicity of a piece of paper and a pencil and an idea, I think it just gets lost. And even in MBA courses now, I think just the notion of creativity feels like a banned substance. It feels flaky in the world right now, and it feels like you can't quantify it. That only numbers and data and algorithms are the future, and I think that's wrong. I think it still comes down to the power of an idea, whether it's an advertising idea, an idea for a movie, an idea for a book, an idea for a blog, an idea for a podcast. It's that little flickering flame that is the most important thing, and I think it's sort of being, forgotten in the mad scramble of this technology era.
Well, I think for me, yes, I 100% agree, and moreover, because ideas are the things that animate all of the things that we think might be more important. So you mentioned data and algorithms and digging into the information that we have about people to market to them, for example, or just I scrolling through Instagram or Facebook and looking for a funny video of a dog falling on its face or something. The thing that animates all of that are the ideas that we share with one another that make it funny or make it appealing or make it powerful. The whole concept that money is really just paper, except that it's imbibed with an idea,
right,
with a concept, and that everything in our world is related to this. I don't know if you know the author Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote a book called *Sapiens*, and another one called *Homo Deus*. And his contention, and I've spoken about it a few times on the podcast, but his contention is that the great revolution of the human species, because his book is a history of our species, was 70,000 years ago. We developed the brain capacity to share ideas with one another, and moreover, to share an imagination, to share intentionality, so that you and I going into a hunt, for example, would have imagined the hunt before. It wasn't right. Like we were squirrels or wolves that were just acting out of instinct. We'd actually played it through in our minds, and we both knew that we had the same idea that we were about to do. That one revolution led to agriculture, which led to the Industrial Revolution, which leads to the digital age, and everything that we have is animated by the idea that we can share an imagined construct of the world together.
Right.
The thing that separates us from animals. And so if we're distracted on our phones or on the internet or just walking through our day and pretending that creativity is a fad, we're actually making the mistake that we're missing the fact that all of this is animated by a shared understanding. And the only reason we find a particular Super Bowl commercial funny is because we share in the understanding of all the ideas that underpin it. And
that's right. It's a shorthand.
Yeah. At the beginning of your book, you talk about advertising being like architecture. Well, I think that they're so similar because architecture is, the physical world around us, but ideas are the architecture of our whole culture and society.
Yeah. It's our infrastructure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree with that, Ben. I think that's exactly right. The thing is about creativity is you can't hold it in your hand, and you can't get your arms around it. It's just such a fleeting, ethereal aspect of our lives. But as you said, it has fueled everything. It has fueled the mic you're speaking into, the screen I see behind your head, the clothes you're wearing. It's every single thing is the result of someone's creative idea. Yeah.
And an architecture of all of those ideas that have built on top of each other for thousands and thousands of years. And it's what makes history.
Don't you think, Ben, that when you look at the progress of civilization and then you hit the 20th century and you see the acceleration in the 20th century, that it is astounding? Like it was, the 20th century began with horses and buggies, and then it ended up being on the moon. in 100, and that was actually 69 years, right?
Yeah. And
that's half a lifetime almost. Like that's small span of time for all that to happen.
One lifetime. I could have experienced that. I could have gone from, a horse and buggy world to landing on the moon to the paradigm shifts that we see today. And again, as you say, it's underpinned by human creativity, but it would have been impossible without all of the creativity that came before. It's not coming out of a vacuum. And then it just begs the question of where do we go from here? If it continues to accelerate, how does and I know it's the old crystal ball question, and I'm not trying to look for an answer, but it requires us to speculate creatively on what the world could be in 5 years. I mean, that's what the creative giants of Silicon Valley have done, is just look 2 years away. Well, what could people want, or what do they want right now that I can build? Yeah.
Steve Jobs was kind of interesting in that regard. He didn't use focus groups. He didn't do research. Steve Jobs just created the products that he figured he would like. He didn't want to count on anybody else. I mean, his famous line was, of course, if he had asked people, if Henry Ford had asked people what they really wanted, they would have said a faster horse. They wouldn't have said a car, right? So it's an interesting thing. You've got to rely on your instincts. You've got to be endlessly curious, as we said, kind of coming full circle. You've got to pull all the threads of all the past creativity and be curious about everything that's going on, and then you synthesize that into your own creative ideas. You can drink Gatorade, as this is a great saying. You can drink Gatorade, but what you sweat is your own. Right? You're taking in something that's already been constructed, but once it goes through your body and your thought system, what you come out with is you. And I think that's the essence of creativity, is taking it all in, synthesizing it, juggling it, and then filtering it, and then putting it through your particular point of view in the world. And that's what makes creativity so absolutely fascinating.
Well, I think this applies perfectly to you and your career, because when I read about the ads that you've made, but also listen to your show Under the Influence, there's a clear thread of a sense of humor. And the sense of humor to me is something that you would find funny if it were played back to you by somebody else. And that makes it authentic. And
Well, like Steve Jobs, I can say this, Ben. I make episodes that I would want to listen to. That's really my sole criteria. I'm not pandering to anybody. I'm really just saying, what would I like to hear about? What subject would be intriguing to me? And I really just try and create a show that I would listen to. That's really as authentic as I can be about that.
Well, I think it does the trick. Terry, thanks so much for taking the time. This has been a really fantastic conversation.
Thanks, Ben. That was amazing questions you were asking. That was really enjoyable.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
To learn more about Terry O'Reilly, go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can listen to all previous episodes as well as all future episodes, and you can get in touch with me to give me your suggestions for future episodes and future guests to have on the podcast. As well, if you like the show, please go to iTunes or Facebook or whatever podcast app that you use and give it a rating. I'd really appreciate your support. Now, your quote of the week is from Terry O'Reilly's book, This I Know, Marketing Lessons from Under the Influence. It's actually 2 bits that I pulled from Chapter 8. Here goes. One of the best ways to develop counterintuitive strategies is to consider doing the one thing that makes no sense. And following just after that, we all know what déjà vu is, looking at an unfamiliar situation and feeling as if you have seen it before. But vuja is the opposite. It means looking at a familiar situation as if you have never seen it before. Special thanks, as always, to our composer, Andrea Wetstein, for providing this wonderful music. And next week, we're speaking with Canadian Senator Kim Pate about her long career fighting for criminal justice and penal reform in Canada. I'll see you then.